even then I knew there would be consequences. Even then I knew it wouldn't be easy, but it's the right thing to do. And the reason that previous attempts to change culture haven't worked is because they've done what's easy, not what's right. And what's easy tends to be putting some posters up and doing some performative, rhetorical stuff. And what's easy as well is to make it about blame. So orthopedic surgeons are bullies, doctors are bullies, nurses are bullies, whoever. And you come out with these kind of very blamey, finger pointy, us versus them, siloed, tribal opinions that are normally pretty evangelical as well. Thou must never misbehave at work. Thou must never raise your voice or swear or whatever, because of course it then falls apart in about 2 seconds flat, because it's not real life.
I never give up. I never give up. I never give up. Turn around.
Hi folks, welcome back to Neff Inspiration, my show on YouTube and as a podcast with me, your host, Stefan Neff. Today I've got the honor of having a colleague with me. And this colleague is an orthopedic surgeon who has made it his mission to challenge the status quo in all the right ways, because he challenges us with regards to our behaviors, with regards to maybe not so nice behaviors, i.e. the toxic work environment, the bullying that still unfortunately is quite prevalent in many workplaces around the world. And Simon Fleming, my guest today, has made it his mission to change that. Simon, welcome to my show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Now, we all come to a certain point in our life where we want to speak out. For me, it is, I've gone through a lot of trauma and in my life, and to just make sense of it, I nowadays share it. Now, I assume you didn't just wake up one day and think, you know what? I think I'm going to speak out against bullying because I have nothing better to do as an orthopedic surgeon. Yeah, I don't believe so. What's the background there? What makes you speak out?
It's a tough one. I've reflected on it a lot. So to give a little bit of background without turning this into, therapy, my father was a Holocaust survivor. So there's some interesting generational trauma whenever you meet anyone who's gone through something like that. And he didn't do a great deal of parenting, again, a kind of generational boomer type vibe. He worked hard and that was it. But one of the things he would often share with both myself and my sister, and both of us work in similar spaces, is this idea he had when he was young and witnessing, the atrocities of World War II, was twofold. One, the role of bystanders, the role of people just stood there and watched. They just saw what was happening to their fellow human beings, to their neighbors, and they kind of didn't do anything. They stayed silent and hoped it would pass them by. And the other bit, and of course this is through a somewhat paternalistic lens, was his concept of, it's the role of people with power to protect those without, which again it is a little white knighty and all that sort of stuff. But from his point of view, it was the fact that there were people out there who could have done more and didn't, who had privilege, who had other things and chose not to. Now, I've fundamentally, if you speak to my mom or my friends, I've always been the guy who asks the difficult questions. My teachers used to hate it. My parents used to hate it. But for me, what really sparked it off was as I went through my undergraduate and my postgraduate life, increasingly recognizing that I wanted to be a surgeon, wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon, which is a journey in and of itself. And every now and then having these moments where I just felt really shitty about myself. I felt anger, guilt, shame, all these kind of really negative emotions. And I couldn't really work out why. And I just kind of, as you do, as most people do, compartmentalized it and moved on. What I eventually came to realize is that those emotions were moral injury, where you either choose to or are forced to, and there's often a blurred line as to which is which, act against your core values. So it's when the crowd you're with make the racist joke or the sexist comment, and you don't just laugh along, you really get into it. Your high fives and fist bumps and all this sort of stuff, right? Because you want to fit in and you don't want to be the odd one out, and you don't want to be the fun sponge who goes, well, you know, that I can't believe you said that, man. And they're right here. And you know, when someone's misgendering someone, you don't necessarily want to be the person who goes. And this happened to me throughout my undergrad as a kind of extroverted sports playing, all that sort of stuff. But I couldn't really put my finger on it. And then as I got into my surgical training, I noticed it more and more. It became less and less subtle and more overt. It went from, you know, the odd comment to a real culture of those sorts of behaviors. And I just thought it was just me. You know, my issue with these behaviors kind of othered me anyway. And like, let's not kid ourselves. I'm a straight, white, privately educated, you know, man. I'm pretty aware of my privilege. And so to say that my core values made me not fit in, like, speaks volumes, right? I look and sound like about the most orthopedic person there is. And yet my attitudes and behaviors made it so that I wasn't in the club. And I got involved with trainee politics back in the UK, the British Orthopaedic Trainee Association. And one of the biggest criticisms of us, just as with any membership organization really, was like, where do you get off saying you speak on behalf of everyone? And obviously the textbook answer is, well, as a democratically elective representative, it's my job. And I have people who share their experiences with me. And that's about as arrogant and entitled as you can get, you know. And so actually we started to do that thing that surgeons are so famous for, right? We started to reflect, and we wondered maybe whether we weren't speaking on behalf of everyone, where maybe we were just sharing our beliefs and values. So we decided to do a census. We decided to ask our membership what they felt, what they wanted, where they were in life, which had never been done before. Now they're all over the place. Yeah. But at the time, no one was gathering this data from trainees. And the data that was being gathered in the UK was through our regulator, the General Medical Council. Oh. They do a survey every year. Problem with them is, and I've worked with the GMC and they know my views, so I have no problems with criticizing some of the stuff they do, is that their survey, which they do every year, it's not mandatory, but you fail your year if you don't do it. And if you want to raise concerns about anything, you're training the culture, you give up your anonymity. Ooh. So you've got to imagine, I want to say, you know, Dr. Neff, my boss, is a bully and is a terrible trainer. And maybe I don't even go that far. Maybe I just say, Dr. Neff isn't a great trainer. I'm not having a great time with him at all. The first thing they do is sit me down opposite you. So as you might imagine, you're unlikely to raise concerns. And they do things like they ignore data from if n equals less than a certain number. So it means that smaller specialties, smaller units, their data just gets lost in the system because, anyway. So we did this census and we were designing it. And at the time I was vice president of the organization. And I'd said, I want to be president. And we have democratic elections. You know, there's no succession planning. And everyone said, okay, well, what are you going to run on? What's your platform? And I said, culture. And I'd like to put some questions in our survey about culture. And everyone was like, that's the hill you want to die on? Not curriculum, not study budgets, not exams, not salaries. I was like, no, culture is what we are. It's who we are. It's the force field you walk through that lets you know you're on an orthopedic ward round. It's the force field you walk through that lets you know you're in Sydney, not Melbourne, or London, not Manchester. It's culture. And everyone said, all right, if you want, really, fine. And part of it as well, if I'm being honest, was just I wanted to know if it was just me. If I really was the odd one out. And so I convinced the committee to put some questions into this census, this survey about culture around bullying, undermining, harassment and discrimination, which are pretty emotive terms, and we can talk about definitions if you want, but fundamentally what came back is, or was, the backbone of what is now a global culture change kind of zeitgeist. Now, interestingly, I was doing this work in the UK at the same time the Australasians were doing their Operate with Respect work. Just apropos nothing, they were going through a very similar journey. The difference being that the Australasian work was coming through the Royal Australian College of Surgeons, and my work was me. And what came out of the survey of the census, this is 2015 now, is when my journey really started, was that we had a culture of bullying, undermining, harassment, and discrimination in orthopedics. And I thought it was going to be a passion project. I thought it was going to be a soapbox for me to stand on for 12 to 18 months. I would make some small changes. I would feel better as a human being and life would move on. And that's absolutely not how it played out. People came out of the woodwork, not just from orthopedics, but from other surgical specialties and non-surgical specialties. Exactly. And not just from the UK, but from around the world, saying, yeah, like this really resonates. And so for me, that's where it started. And I remember sitting down with my friends and my partner at the time and being like, this is so much bigger than I imagined it was and thought it was. I think I need to decide here and now, because I either have to kind of go all in or I need to back away really quickly. There's a quote, don't half-ass two things, whole-ass one thing. Like, it was very much I've either got to go in or I've got to run. And I couldn't bring myself to run. And I found that I was sleeping better at night doing this work. And we spoke about it before, before we pressed record. Even then I knew there would be consequences. Even then I knew it wouldn't be easy. But it's the right thing to do. And the reason that previous attempts to change culture haven't worked is because they've done what's easy, not what's right. And what's easy tends to be putting some posters up and doing some performative, rhetorical stuff. And what's easy as well is to make it about blame. So orthopedic surgeons are bullies, doctors are bullies, nurses are bullies, whoever. And you come out with these kind of very blamey, finger pointy, us versus them, siloed, tribal opinions that are normally pretty evangelical as well. Thou must never misbehave at work. Thou must never raise your voice or swear or whatever. Because of course it then falls apart in about 2 seconds flat, because it's not real life. And actually, that was a lesson I learned pretty early on, because in the first couple of weeks of me starting this work, I was pretty evangelical too. I was pretty blamey too. And people really pushed back, and I couldn't understand why. I couldn't understand why I was saying, look, don't bully one another. Don't be a racist. Don't be a sexist. Like, surely this is pushing against an open door. And it was only when I realized that it was because I was making it a blame game that's why people were resisting. I remember talking to my mum about this years ago, and she said that when she went to school, her parents asked around about which school hit kids the most, because generationally speaking, those were your best schools. The strictest schools that didn't spare the rod got the best results, right? And it's true, right? Stefan, you're not an orthopedic surgeon. If I say to you, right, tomorrow I'm going to ask you how to do a hip replacement, and if you don't know, I'm going to punch you in the face. I guarantee you'll go away and do everything you can.
Oh, yeah.
But if you don't, right? If you think, sure, right, whatever. And if tomorrow I come in and punch you in the face, the next time, you damn better believe you're going to do the work. It works, right? It's the same. They use it in school. We used it in medicine. They used it in the military. They used it all over the world.
Yep.
The difference is most of the world has worked out that there are better ways of doing things. We've worked out that, yeah, you can hit kids and they will learn their times tables, but actually there are better ways of training children. Now, the question is, the fact that my mum went to a school where she was hit with a stick and all this sort of stuff, does that make my grandparents bad people? Or does that make my mum's teachers bad people?
No.
Fundamentally, no, of course not. It's the Maya Angelou quote of do the best you can until you know better, and once you know better, do better.
Mm.
Those people had no idea. They were doing the best they can. So I realized that most of the people I was saying, you're a bully, you're a bad trainer, you're a whatever, what you're saying there is, it's the cancel culture vibe of, you're a sexist, you're a racist. There are a huge swathe of people out there who, until they hear me speak, read something, whatever, they're like, really? That's a problem? I, I'm not sexist by always describing surgeons as he. It's just all the surgeons I know are men. Right. And I can see where that might come from. So let's have a conversation about how changing your language might change that. And let's have a conversation about how diversifying your workforce improves outcomes and will make you money and we'll do all these other things. And so that was really where the journey began, was realizing that not only was it a huge body of work that I needed to do, but that it was so much more nuanced, so much more subtle, and so much bigger and ingrained in everything we do than I thought it was. One of my favorite things to say when I speak to like the great and the good, because certainly back home in the UK, and I've heard the same rhetoric in Canada and Mexico and Argentina and Australia and a million other places I've spoken, is this idea of we have to fix healthcare. We have to fix it. We have to mend it. We have to mend medicine. And my shtick is, no, because it's not broken. It was built this way. If you go back to the foundations of the NHS, for example, it was a healthcare system built by old straight white dudes to support the careers and aspirations of younger straight white dudes. It never imagined women having jobs where they weren't nurses. Certainly didn't imagine people of color, the LGBTQ community, IMGs. It never imagined any of that. So it didn't imagine less than full-time training, paternity and parental leave. It wasn't built on those foundations or through that lens. So it can't possibly be surprising to people that on a systematic level, it's hierarchical, patriarchal, all of that stuff, because that's how it started. That's how all this stuff started. And so when we talk about changing culture, the bit I think that scares people the most is the reality that for certain things, we're going to have to go down to not just foundations, but we're going to have to pull those up too in certain cases. One of the pieces of work I'm involved in at the moment, of which there's many, is looking at assessment models, just how we test people, how we examine people. And the bit that people find so uncomfortable is you start to pick apart, like I said, well, we have better ways of testing, we have better ways of assessing. But the whole idea of a lot of these things was still built however many decades ago by a group of straight white men to test their younger straight white colleagues. And so it's not surprising that they go, neurodivergent people? What do you mean? Oh, what do you mean that it's really hard for you to revise while you're also caring for your children and less than full time? What do you mean? And it really cuts to the heart of people. It cuts to their core values because it feels like an attack. It feels like the you're a bad parent, you're a bad teacher narrative. And of course it's not, but it isn't nice. It isn't a nice feeling to have someone go, what you've been doing is great, but are you aware of this unintentional harm? Now, all of that sounds a little bit apologist. There are certain behaviors that you damn well know are toxic and you just don't care. You know that you can get away with it. So this is where you get into the realms of the real bullying, the explicit, conscious stuff. This is where you get into the real racism. Like people, my dad before he passed had lived all over the world, spoke 7 or 8 languages, and he used to love asking people where they were from because chances were he'd been there and he spoke their language. He couldn't understand why, as a straight white Australian, asking the person of color driving the cab where they're from might upset them, right? He couldn't see how that could be perceived as racist or might scare them or make them nervous. He was just interested in people, and we had to have some difficult conversations about ways of doing it that allow you to express those interests without coming across as racist. I had a consultant who was an amazing mentor and trainer, and he couldn't understand why when he asked his trainees who were women about their potential plans to have a family, why he would get shouted at and get into trouble and all the rest. And he asked me for advice. And we had to have a sit down about the difference between turning around to a woman and saying, so when you're having kids, and going, so welcome to the team. I'm here to support you in any way you can. And if you'd like to have a conversation about planning for your future, whether that's fellowships, career, family, or anything, I'm here to have those conversations with you. And if there are any questions I can't answer, or if you just don't feel comfortable speaking to a bloke about that sort of stuff, I've got friends and allies who are open to have those conversations with you. And he was like, oh my God, that's so many more words. And I'm like, yeah, but they're the right words. And they're the words you should be using, not when you're going to have kids, or God, I hope you're not going to be one of these ones that goes off on maternity leave. Even though it might be coming from a place of concern and empathy and interest and general desire to make the world a better place. And those behaviors, again, it's very easy to go, well, look, you just need to have a conversation with someone. But if you're making homophobic jokes, if you're making racist comments, if you are sexually assaulting your junior colleagues, look, right? You know that these behaviors are wrong. You may not just care. You may just think that you may have found ways to rationalize them away. But and what's hilarious is the people who really don't think they're wrong, those are the people who just shouldn't be in healthcare. But we need to identify them. And up until very recently, we had no systems and no way of doing that, because often through the system being what it is, those people had found their ways to positions of power. So it was, oh, well, Prof is a bit handsy, but you know what he's like.
And it's tricky. I mean, it is all a spectrum. And what is seriously upsetting for one person, the next person says, well, what are you all about? So it's really, really tricky to actually draw lines. I was an instructor for ATLS and CRISP course, so surgical courses. And on the third day of the CRISP course, there is sort of half of the team, half of the trainees are doing a test, and the other half are sort of talk. And I don't know what drove me, but that morning I sort of said, hey guys, who of you has been abused at work? And I don't know why it came out. I don't know why it came to my mind, but you could hear a pin drop. And suddenly a hand went up. Another hand went up. Another hand. So among the trainees, 3 went up. And I looked around, we were 3 instructors, and suddenly one of the instructors actually raised his hand. And I thought, okay, oh, hornet's nest here. So it turned out to be quite a significant amount. And there was anything from sexual abuse, being cornered in the shower, to really bullying, etc. The other thing to say is, I mean, 1% of the population are psychopaths and sociopaths. Really nasty pieces of work. And maybe, just maybe, surgeons, I don't know the figures, if there is a little bit more. I don't know.
There's a great paper in the Royal College of Surgeons of England Bulletin called Are Surgeons Psychopaths?
I have not read that.
It's a great paper. It keeps coming up in like most read, most cited papers of the year. The only people who score higher than us, I think, are pediatricians. And it's an interesting conversation. There's a guy called Kevin Dutton who's a professor of psychopathy in the UK.
Yeah.
And he talks about this. You probably do want a certain amount of psychopathic or sociopathic, but psychopathic trait in your surgeons. And it's why you see it in pediatricians too. You need to be able to dial down your empathy. If you think about what we do on our day job, you need to be able to turn that off a little bit, or have less of it than someone who's a true empath. I cut people open and I break their bones for a living, and then I go home to my family. And normal people would find that problematic, and it doesn't really bother me.
There's a new series of Dexter waiting here for us to do orthopedic version.
Exactly right. You see psychopathic trait in successful chief execs, in successful surgeons, in successful soldiers.
A
certain amount of fearlessness a certain amount of being goal orientated in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. You hear about psychopaths having superficial charisma, right? Now, the true psychopaths use that for criminal purposes. But again, if you think about the fact that most doctors meet someone and very rapidly have to garner trust and rapport, well, the way you're going to do that is by being able to walk into a room with a stranger and within a second or two have them go, I really like this person. I'm going to let them cut me up and put me to sleep and all that sort of stuff. And you're right. Again, there's everything from trait to pathology. And yeah, there are probably certain people I've certainly worked with some who are on the more pathological side. But what's interesting is I think that's an excuse, because the data would suggest that the rates of all of these behaviors I'm talking about are much, 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 much higher than 1%, which is your clinically diagnosed psychopaths, right? These are the people who should be under the care of a mental health team. But if you think that the best evidence we have in the gender-based violence field, for example, is approximately a 1 to 2% rate of staff-on-staff rape, a 10 to 20% rate of staff-on-staff sexual assault, and up to 65% of sexual harassment, your 1% suddenly goes out the window, right? Now, your 1%.
Okay, stop. What are we talking about here? Where is the data coming from?
So because that data comes from the two biggest data sets, though there are others, are in fact from the RACS, the Royal Australian College of Surgeons Operate with Respect data, and a recent paper published in the BJS looking at UK data. Now, what's really interesting is the best data we have, if you extrapolate that, is that we know that all these behaviors are underreported.
Exactly.
Up to 1 in 20. So if you then start to do the maths, or if we just say, you know what, Stefan, there's no underreporting. That is the hard data. But I then tell you that the NHS has 1.5 million employees.
Exactly.
Then you start to extrapolate that, and you're still like, oh, what? So the nearly blaming but not blaming, the hiding behind a mental health diagnosis is challenging, because there are undeniably people with mental health problems, and those people need to be identified and supported appropriately. But the data suggests that most of the people doing this, competent, have capacity, have no diagnosis of import, because again, most healthcare professionals have some trauma, some burden, some baggage, and it's just people being dicks.
So then the next question that raises itself is this a cultural issue? Is this something peculiar to the UK? Are you just chauvinistic bastards over there?
Yes, but we're not alone.
Good answer.
So again, there's a lot to unpack, because of course, when you get into the colonial side of things, places like the UK and France and Spain populated, invaded, took over, enslaved most of the world, and so certain values have been distributed generously. However, the modern take on it is that these behaviors are pretty much everywhere. I've not found anywhere that doesn't have them. What you do find, though, and again, it's difficult for people to get their head around, is context is everything. So I will often get emails from either individuals or organizations or governments, countries, whatever, saying, please could we have the recipe book to solve our culture problem, our bullying problem, our discrimination problem, whatever it might be. And the answer is no, you can't. There are certain principles that you can absolutely outline. And I always say, look, here they are, or let's have a Zoom chat and I can share those with you. But everywhere has their own flavor, their own nuance, their own context. So what's an example? I did some work with some pediatric cardiologists. And they did like general pediatric on calls. And one of the professors there was highlighted to me as being a real problem. And I said, okay, give me an example. And apparently this professor every morning would start the meeting with, right, team, let's talk about the children you killed last night. And when he was challenged on that, he honestly, without a hint of remorse, said, no, they need to know that if they make mistakes, children die. And if they make mistakes because they've not done their reading, or they've not been good enough, or they've not been switched on enough, then those children perhaps died unnecessarily. Like, he didn't feel any remorse. He didn't feel that his comments were in any way problematic. But but he very much was framing it through a patient-centered lens. It was all about the patient. It wasn't about him or his ego or money, or he was like, you have to think of the children. And you know, if you I've done work in the Scandinavian region, and what was fascinating is you ask them about their diversity, for example, and a load of organizations came back and said, oh, we don't collect that data because we don't have a diversity problem. These are intelligent, insightful, well-meaning people. And you say, well, what do you mean? You can't make that statement if you don't have any data. And I go, no, because no one's ever complained. Like, everyone we speak to, everyone we engage. And then, of course, we look at their board and they all look a certain way and sound a certain way. But until you have these conversations, that in that context, they pride themselves on being inclusive and open and extremely pragmatic, and they're super welcoming and all this sort of stuff. And yet when you go, you're aware that like all of you are 6 foot plus blonde men, right? And they're like, you know, no, Sven has brown hair. And you're like, yeah, but you can still see why that's maybe an issue. And they're like, no, if women wanted the job, they'd apply, surely. And so everywhere has its context, but these behaviors are everywhere. And it's because part of it's just human nature. You know, most of us understand intrinsically power dynamics, and most human beings like having power. It's nice. It's a nice feeling to be able to tell someone to milk 2 sugars and just know it's going to happen, or not have to do that task that you think is onerous because you can tell someone else to do it, or feeling really crappy about yourself and knowing that actually you can make yourself feel a little bit better by making someone else feel small. And so these behaviors exist everywhere in the world, but in healthcare in particular, we are in this bubble of, a guy called Eric Hombo calls it nostalgia imperfecta, this kind of bubble of protected nostalgia that keeps us exempt from a lot of social norms that are sort of overtaking us. You know, if you know, we still have to, in certain spaces, call people Dr. So-and-so, whatever. And you're like, I'm a 40-year-old man. Why can't I call you by your first name? Oh, well, I expect them, you know, how dare you?
But then again, I mean, this could be very much a more UK nuanced issue.
It's just not, though. That's the thing.
Interesting, because certainly out here in New Zealand, and certainly when I was working in Australia, equally, I had sort of the sensation it was far more informal. I mean, the last time I wore a tie was in the UK. So, you know, it is. There seems to be.
It depends, but this is the context. It depends where you work. It depends what you're doing. So, for example, you're an anaesthetist, I believe, right? If you speak to anaesthetists, they talk about the hierarchy in the critical care setting, in the ICU setting, and how that can be extremely toxic. They talk about the clashes that they sometimes witness between anaesthetists, anaesthetic trainee, anaesthetic practitioners, theatre practitioners, between the registrar and the fellow. They talk about being bystanders and witnessing toxic behaviors in the operating theatre, but not feeling like they can speak up because it's got that whole, you know, this is the theatre, what goes on tour stays on tour. You know, it would you know, what you would joke about in theatre isn't something you would joke about in a corridor or on the ward, but it's the operating theatre. It's a different space. And so every specialty, every country, every healthcare system has its own models, its own nuance. And that's where the challenge starts, because of course, the moment you start talking about this stuff, you get, and you've just done it very elegantly, you go, well, not where I work. And you go, well, actually, all of the data ever would suggest yes, where you work.
Good point. I'll take that. Yeah, good point.
But not necessarily, again, in the way that it is in the UK or in America or in Mexico or in Canada or in wherever. So, you know, and there are places that are more equitable and less equitable, but I'm I'm sure I know that if you look at the diversity data for surgery in New Zealand, you're not leading any of the charts by any country mile, and people go, oh yeah, well, actually, yeah, they're if you think that the country in the world with the most female orthopedic surgeons is Estonia, and they've got 25%. Like, that's the highest in the world. So nowhere is anywhere near 50-50. Not that we're aiming for 50-50, but the highest in the world is Estonia with 25. So the challenge is, again, our natural urge is to go, yeah, but not me, not where I work. And I talk about this a lot. And again, it's something I experienced a great deal in the early stages of my advocacy, is when I would present this data, like the really hard-hitting stuff, and I would share anecdotes, horrible anecdotes that I share with permission. There's a real bell curve of humanity. And on one end of the bell curve are the villains, right? The people who got into healthcare because they like it, that people have to stand up when they walk into a room. They love the power, the fact that people have to call them respect. You know those people, though, right? They love that they have the power of life and death, and they enjoy that God complex over their colleagues as much as their patients. On the other end of the spectrum are the equally problematic angels. And they are the people who will say, I've never seen racism in healthcare. I've never seen sexual harassment in healthcare. I've never seen bullying. And the reason they've never seen it is often for a variety of reasons around, well, their own privilege. So in other words, it's never happened to them. Stefan, I imagine no one's ever mistaken you for the nurse or the cleaning lady, right? You speak to your female colleagues, I guarantee you they've all had it. But it's never happened to you, right? And similarly, a lot of them, the allies especially, will say, I'm such an open, approachable guy. People would tell me if this stuff was happening. And you're like, no, they wouldn't. Because you're still part of those power systems where if they say to you, my consultant grabs my ass whenever we're in theatre, you're going to go, does he? What were you wearing? Like all the usual slut-shaming, heteronormative comments that people say rather than, that must be awful, tell me more about that.
I'm not sure that the scrubs nowadays come in miniskirt way. I mean, luckily we all wear the same thing.
But this is the thing. This is, these are the responses people get when they do speak up.
I hear you.
And so those, my test for this, when I do this in big auditoriums, I tell this story with permission, is there was a colleague of mine who was published in a journal where they put pictures by the byline, so you can go up to people and go, oh, I read your paper, wonderful work. And she was walking down the corridor the day after a journal came out with her article in it. And she was stopped by her professor in the corridor. And her professor said, a word, please. Yes, prof. You see, the thing is, back in the day, we didn't have to hire women. And so when we did hire women, we at least were able to just hire the pretty ones. And the only thing worse than seeing your ugly face at work every day is seeing your ugly face on my coffee table at home. At which point he was dragged away by his fellow. Now, I tell that story because when you tell that to a room full of doctors, not surgeons, doctors, nurses, healthcare professionals, anywhere in the world, most of them can believe it. Most of them might laugh, look aghast like you, but then you think through your years as a professional and you go, I've worked with people who would say that. I've worked with people who would say, oh, I was just joking, or you know what they're like, whatever. You can imagine that one or those two individuals who would say that in the workplace. And then there are a minority of people in the room who will go, I don't believe you. You're making it up. Whereas nearly all of us, if we think through our undergraduate, our postgraduate, our working place, we worked with people like that who were classified as, being a bit blunt, or whatever it is.
And that's a bit more than blunt, may I say.
but and because the rest of us sit on that bell curve, we have good days and bad days. We misspeak, we lose our temper, we say stuff that we wish we hadn't. But these behaviors exist in all of us, and they exist in all of healthcare all around the world. But our first instinct is to go, not me, not where I work, I don't see it, because we don't want to imagine that it's happening where we work, under our noses.
Mm.
Because once you know that, again, the Maya Angelou quote, do the best you can till you know better.
Sure.
Once you're looking for it,
Mm.
then you sort of recognize that you have to either do something about it or willfully be ignorant and go, oh, well, that was a racist comment, but I'll let that slide.
Mm.
You know, you work in New Zealand. It wasn't that long ago that every other joke was about the First Nations people and the Maori,
Mm.
right? And I bet they're still made in quiet rooms and corridors when no one's around.
Mm.
You know, these behaviors still persist. It's just that once you acknowledge that that is the case, you have to decide whether you're going to do something about it or not.
You made a very good point there, because ultimately there are people who have created their own culture in a very positive way, and maybe they were lucky throughout their time in the healthcare profession. I mean, taking a different example here from my show. So many women have experienced sexual violence, and if you look at the figures, it's shocking. You're talking 1 in 3 women in their lifetime will be raped or have sexual violence. Massive. And when I heard these figures the first time around, I thought, nah, I've never met a girl who was raped. Nah, bullshit. Not with me, not in Germany. And then I actually did the homework and actually looked up the rape figures in Germany, and they were not different. There was no difference there. It was just me being blissfully ignorant until I did the homework and looked out for it. So there was no one opened up to me. Maybe I never asked the questions. How it never came about. But nowadays I'm so much more aware of the problem that is playing out for so many individuals behind closed doors. And I say individuals because certainly the LGBT community is even further at risk. We see so many more issues there. So, of course, why should they not also flow over into our workspace, into our, the places where we actually spend, a third of our day?
It's the corollary of having an increasingly diverse workforce.
True.
Is that the intersectional nature of these problems are going to declare themselves more and more. So, if you're a woman, you are at risk of X, Y, and Z. You are, for example, less likely to get promoted. You're going to have a gender pay gap. You are less likely to pass your postgraduate exams. But if you're a woman and a person of color, well, that's a compounder. If you're a woman and a person of color and you have caring responsibilities, if you're a woman and a person of color, or you're pregnant, if you're a woman and a person of color and you're a member of the LGBTQ community. So as we get more diverse workforces, which we absolutely should and must have, the like you say, that crossover, that cross-pollination as well is going to become even more obvious and make addressing these issues so much more challenging, because again, someone recently described gender within the diversity inclusivity space as low-hanging fruit. But of course, gender is on a spectrum. And so those conversations are not as simple as they were perceived to be 10 or 15 years ago, when a lot of this work started, where there were men and there were women, and that was that. And again, a lot of people in those spaces are now having to completely readjust and learn more, and like you say, go away and do their homework. But most importantly, and I do a big talk about how to be an ally, right? And my big take home point is to just shut up, which is what most men in particular are not used to doing, right? Because actually, if you're quiet and you listen, you will suddenly realize that you don't necessarily have to go away and read a million books and PubMed search. And the reality is that who is heard and who is not heard maintains the status quo. And if you do enough listening, you will suddenly learn a lot more about what is not being heard, what is not being seen, than you will necessarily going away and, Googling.
These are very, very important points you are making. The question then, of course, raises itself. If you start to listen and you hear things that are not right, speaking out has always come with a price. It's not for nothing that whistleblowers might as well hand in their job now, because that inevitably they will be fired. They will be, whilst officially organizations have got ways of protecting whistleblowers, yeah, about that. So the other thing is that we are working in healthcare organizations where you sign a contract. And if you actually read the little fine print in there, you will find sooner or later a little paragraph. If you were to say anything negative against the organization in which you're working in a public setting, this is reason for dismissal. Yeah, interesting.
So I've had threats against my career. I've had death threats towards me, towards my family. I'm looking for a consultant job now, and there are certain individuals who feel that I've washed healthcare's dirty laundry in public and brought us into disrepute and all this sort of stuff. I don't agree with that. Obviously, you know, if you speak to medical students and patients, nearly all of them say that the kind of work I do is actually giving them greater trust and faith in the healthcare system. But you're absolutely right. The role of being an advocate, of being an active bystander, comes with a cost. Now, of course, the goal is, the dream is that you make everyone an active bystander, and eventually you normalize it such that it no longer has those consequences. But again, you know, like you say, though, there's that paragraph in your contract, and so partly there's a real art form to calling stuff out and not getting fired. And partly there is something to be said for those organizations having to take a long, hard look at themselves in the mirror and ask why they are not open to criticism. And it's because most of them don't have a growth mindset. They're not looking to grow and learn and be better. They just want things to keep ticking along. And I kind of understand why, because that's what keeps the lights on, and it doesn't rock the boat, and it doesn't create headaches for people. But actually, you know, I've had people threaten me with reporting me to the regulator, with getting me fired, with this, that, and the other. And you know, I do a lot of work on social media, and I talk about, you know, my rules for social media, which is basically whatever you're saying, if you're willing to say it to your friends and family, if you're willing to say it to a judge, if you're willing to say it to a patient, and if you're willing to see it on the front page of a national newspaper, if you are okay with all of those things, then you do it and you live with the consequences. The consequences are, for me, that yes, there are certain places that wouldn't hire me in a month of Sundays. If I was the last surgeon on earth, they wouldn't hire me. But the other thing is that the flip side is that there are other units who would hire me for the exact same reason.
Exactly.
They want to be, because, you know, let's not kid ourselves. And this is one of my most fun things to do, right? So the great paper from Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago now, looking at some of the behaviors we're talking about, like bullying, undermining, harassment, whatever. So what happens basically when someone is kind of an asshole at work, right? So 80% of recipients of these toxic behaviors will lose time worrying about what happened. Oh my God, why did Stefan say that about me? Does everyone think that about me? Does everyone think I'm an idiot? Does everyone think I'm stupid? Whatever. 40% of people who experience this will reduce the quality, the measurable quality of their work. 50% of people who experience this will reduce their time at work. They will take sick days. They will find reasons not to be around.
Exactly.
And 25% of people will take it out on patients. Now, where it really gets interesting is if you witness these behaviors, right? So it's not me being bullied or me being harassed. I see it happening across the room, in the coffee room, in the accident emergency department, wherever. I see these behaviors. I, as a witness, will have a 20% decrease in my performance, a 50% decrease in my willingness to help others, and I will be 75% less likely to go the extra mile for my organization. The long and the short of that is that the behaviors I'm talking about have been shown in multiple papers, not just that one, to affect outcomes. They harm patients. And not only do they harm patients, there are some great papers that show it costs you money.
Mm.
Or the flip side is, if you get rid of them or make things better, it makes you money. Big paper from the NHS, bullying costs the NHS about £2.4 billion a year, right?
Wow.
Right? So when I have these meetings with these organizations and they talk about the fact that, you know, if one of their interns calls them out for being toxic on Twitter, they should be allowed to haul them in and beat them up and all the rest. And you have this conversation with them, you go, actually, if you create a culture whereby you're really open to criticism, really open to challenge, you want to know about these things, but not in a blame way, in a growth mindset way, it'll make you money.
Yeah.
It'll save you money. It'll make your outcomes better. They go, oh, really? And then you get into the nitty gritty about how to have conversations either on a public or private forum, but how to have conversations about these things. Because again, yeah, if you go on social media and go, Dr. So-and-so is an asshole and he said this and that's not the way, because what you're doing there is you're playing the blame game. You want to see heads roll and you feel better afterwards. You vented and you know that Dr. So-and-so is going to be hauled in, whatever. The big ask for people is you say, if your reason for calling out these behaviors, for being an active bystander, is to bring around real change, it might take you a little bit longer. You might have to put a bit more thought into it and not just go on to Twitter or Instagram or whatever and shout it from the rooftops. There are ways of doing this that can leverage change. And that's not always easy either. You know, the Vanderbilt cup of coffee model, which is a great model for having conversations around unprofessional behaviors, their model starts with a cup of coffee conversation, as in an informal, reflective conversation. So, Stefan, can I buy you a coffee? And we go and we sit down over coffee. And the point is, it's not in my office, it's not in your office, it's not in a corridor. I say, Stefan, either can I let you know how the jokes you made today made me feel, or can I let you know how the jokes you made today made someone else feel? They've asked me to speak to you. Either way. And it's not an easy thing to have. I've been on the receiving end of one of these conversations, and people often get their hackles up and they make excuses, but it's a reflective thing. Look, this is how you made them feel. But the evidence suggests that most people, on the basis of that single conversation, much as they might hate it, will change their behavior forever. They'll think before they make the joke about, you know, women surgeons or nurses or whatever. And then the model goes on to legitimately talk about, well, how do you challenge other behaviors? What if the behaviors don't change? What if they're more toxic than that? You know, Stefan, if you sexually assault someone, I'm probably not going to buy you a cup of coffee and ask you to talk about that, right?
I hope not.
So they have their, you know, right? There's an escalation policy, and that exists and that works. But actually, you're absolutely right. Being a whistleblower does come with consequences. Being a culture change advocate does come with consequences, but I pay them gladly, because for me, the places that wouldn't hire me because I am actively anti-sexism, racism, and all the rest, probably are places I wouldn't want to work anyway. It's not enough. Look, it's not enough to just not be racist. People want a medal because they're not a bully. Like, good for you, man. Well done. Here's a pat on the back for not being an asshole.
An asshole, yeah, exactly.
Right? If you're not anti these things on some level, whether it's strategically, policy-wise, culturally, whatever, if you're not actively anti these toxic behaviors, you're still fundamentally complicit, because you're saying, well, look, I'm not a rapist. I know there are some, but I'm not, so leave me out of it. And actually, the organizations that are like, we don't want to work with these people because they're, you know, woke or whatever, you're like, well, why aren't you? What are you so afraid of? And of course, what they're afraid of is that mirror being held up and finding that some of their policies are maybe not as equitable as they might think. Some of their employees are maybe not as employable as they might think. But the truth will out, and it often does. And so and we joked about this, right? I'm looking for a consultant job. People will go and they will Google me and they will see the work I do.
Mm.
And I would hope that an insightful, progressive chief executive, head of department, whatever, will go, yeah, that's someone we want in our department. Because being able to do the job in our world is sort of a given. Like, but you know,
exactly
at
right.
the end of your training, you should be able to be a doctor in your chosen field. It's all the other stuff you do. And for me, the other stuff I do saves money, makes money, improves patient outcomes, reduces burnout, reduces suicide and depression, increases diversity. Like, let's go. And if it makes you uncomfortable, good. Most of the hardest things are uncomfortable. If they weren't, you'd have done them already.
You're very right. You're very right. And I think that it speaks for you that you have taken that stance. And I could not agree more with you. It is, we need to take a good, hard look at our own behavior. And only if you stop for a moment and reflect on your own words, actions, or lack thereof in the presence of not so nice things happening, only then can you come to conclusions, come to a crossroad where you actually, like you, in your case, where you make a stand, where you actually say, no, okay, I go down the hard route because it's the right route, not the easy, which is not so nice. And I want to come full circle because you were talking about your father and his Jewish history and all the Holocaust and all the Shoah that affected him. There was a beautiful saying from a German resistance fighter who said, when they came for the socialists, I did nothing because I wasn't a socialist. When they came for the gypsies, well, I did nothing because I wasn't a gypsy. When they came for the Jews, I did nothing because I wasn't a Jew. When they came for me, there was no one else left to do something. And it is, I think it is our duty to speak up. It is our duty to listen. And I loved that most. You have got one mouth, two ears, and you really should use them in the same ratio. Listen out to what is happening around you. Make yourself knowledgeable about the pathways within your institution to deal with things, because I have been listening and I have seen cases of bullying, but that then puts a complete new picture on there. I mean, you know, what do you do? And to speak out, to whistleblow, that can be brutal. I've got the T-shirt for it. So it's hard. But then again, that does not mean to say that you should not learn and maybe just lead by your own behavior, with your own behavior. Create a culture within your little sphere of influence, i.e. in my operating room. Have a culture there of being open, being authentic, showing integrity, in the sense of creating something where people can say, hey, look, I've got a real shit day. My mum is probably going into a nursing home with Alzheimer. My head is anywhere but today here, and I'm actually quite angry. But someone who's able to spell that out and being open and honest, with that you have de-escalated already. Or I had exactly that scenario actually happening to me without the nurse actually saying something. She just ripped my head off, just out of the blue, and everyone was just thinking, what the hell? But then again, we had the culture, we had the understanding there that she was, the moment later, she caught herself and said, look, I'm so sorry, and she was open and said, look, hey, this is what is happening. But this is all leading by example. This is all actually being there, being open, and walking the walk, not just talking the talk. Not just having another poster of rainbow colors in your tea room. I 100%.
Formative stuff is often more dangerous than doing nothing at all.
Yeah, touche.
It lets you think you're making a difference, and you're not at all.
Nice. I love it. Simon, you're an amazing man. You're doing such an important job. And as I said before the interview, if you need a place to stay, if I've got a spare room, okay. No, actually, no, I'm making fun here. I actually believe that you are an asset for any future department, and those people who can't see that, they probably don't deserve an asset like you. I can't wait to see where you will end up and what next will come, because you are on a trajectory, you are on a growth journey. So this is what you do now. But then I wonder who Simon will be in 5 years' time. You've got any inkling?
You know what? I honestly don't, and that's kind of the exciting bit. I'm looking in 3 different continents for jobs. I just want to work with the community that I love, which is surgery, and I'm going to stay in the medical education and culture change sphere. And beyond that, you want colleagues who get it and support you, and that you can support them, and that's it. That's what I'm looking for. I'm not, you meet these people who are like, I have to work in this hospital, in this unit, or nothing. And you're like, well, you're going to go run away and join the circus. No.
You would make a very nice bearded lady. Come on.
Yeah,
man.
right. But if my work has taught me anything, it's that actually our community is pretty similar as well. It's why these problems are so prevalent. So I don't know where I'm going to be in 5 years' time, and I'm kind of excited to find out.
Beautiful. Simon, I cross my fingers. I send you all the energy and all the vibes. I'm sure when people see you on my show or on any of the other many speaking engagements that you have had, you are a voice to listen to. You are a man with a mission, and I think that is the beautiful thing. And there are not too many people nowadays where you can say that. So Simon, thank you so much for the work you're doing. Thank you so much for coming onto my show. If people want to know more about you, where can they find you? What shall they do?
I'm everywhere. I'm omnipresent. The easiest places to probably find me beyond my website, which is simonfleming.co.uk, is actually on social media. So I'm on Twitter, on X, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and people can just reach out, as they often do, and I'm on there all the time. So I'll respond in 10 minutes or less.
Guys, look down there into the description of the YouTube video and of the podcast, because Simon's details are all down there. Simon, thank you again for your time, for your passion. I truly had quite a challenging interview, because you actually also challenged me and challenged, some of my thoughts, some of my beliefs, so yes, I will go away from this interview and probably frown a little bit here and there and think, okay, maybe I need to pull my socks up a bit here. And for that, I'm very grateful, because that's the only way how we can grow, how we can become better humans, how we can become better doctors.
It's my absolute pleasure.
And you guys out there, look after yourself and live with passion. Bye.
I never give up. I never give up. I never give up. Turn around.